Want to get you back to what is happening between Russia and Georgia, and a segment of Georgia that has been in dispute for many years now. Well, now that conflict appears to have exploded. Our senior international correspondent Matthew Chance joins us live from Moscow with more details. Hi, Matthew.
Hi, Reggie. A lot of conflicting information coming to us about the conflict zone. We're hearing reports from the Georgian officials, some Georgian forces that are now in full control of the main city in South Ossetia, that breakaway region of Georgia, which, as you say, has been in dispute, been trying to break away from Georgia for well over 15 years, since the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 1990s. Georgian forces now saying they're in complete control of the main city, Skinvali, in South Ossetia. That's being denied, though, by rebel spokesmen. The rebel spokespeople that we've been hearing quoted on the Interfax news agency. They're saying there's still fierce fighting underway between separatist rebels in South Ossetia and Georgian forces. Separately, we've heard from Georgian officials that at least 4 Russian aircraft have been shot down by Georgian forces over Georgian territory. The Georgians accuse the Russians of supporting the separatist movement in South Ossetia. Indeed, Russia has condemned what's been taking place in South Ossetia, the hours of aerial bombardment and artillery shelling that the Georgian forces have been conducting in order to try and regain control over this breakaway territory. They've sent their own troops into South Ossetia. Russian state television broadcasting dramatic images of tanks and armoured personnel carriers from Russia crossing the border into South Ossetia in order to, they say, provide support for the thousands of Russian peacekeepers who are already stationed in South Ossetia. So a lot of dramatic developments taking place, very sketchy information at this stage, but a very dangerous situation that's emerged in South Ossetia between Russia and Georgia.
You know, we did hear from the Georgian president this morning, and Jonathan Mann asked him very directly, what would you have President Bush do about this? And while he didn't ask for any specific, details from President Bush, he did say that this, in his mind, was comparable to what happened between Russia and Afghanistan many years ago when President Reagan was in charge and actually did do something to intervene. So I'm wondering if there are calls now for U.S. intervention.
Well, I think that there'll be calls for US intervention within Georgia, obviously. It's a tiny country, remember, and it's taken the step of essentially confronting the world's biggest country. Russia, it may not be a superpower anymore, but it's still a formidable military power, certainly in this region. And Georgia is a tiny handkerchief-sized country, former Soviet state, that is now confronting this giant Russian neighbour. The only chance that Georgia stands of any kind of success in this is if it can get the international community on its side. It knows it can't confront Russia on its own, but if it sets its position within the context of an international kind of fight for freedom, appeals for the European Union, for NATO, for the United States to come to its assistance, then that gives it a chance militarily, economically, politically of surviving this. Otherwise, it doesn't stand much chance at all. The question is, will the United States, will the European Union put its relationship with Russia on the line in order to defend tiny Georgia in the Caucasus? That's very much an unanswered question.
And just one more thing before I go, Matthew. What is Russia's end game here? What is the purpose of all this? As you say, Georgia is a tiny nation, and within that, South Ossetia is even smaller. So why would Russia go to all of this trouble to protect this tiny part of a tiny nation? What are they trying to get at here?
Well, I think there are a number of aims that Russia has. First and foremost, I think they have a geopolitical aim to stop Georgia from joining the NATO military alliance. I mean, NATO has been expanding since the collapse of the Soviet Union. Georgia, along with Ukraine and other former Soviet states, are the next tier in line for NATO membership. Russia wants to make sure that does not happen. One of the best ways of making sure that doesn't happen is by promoting instability in a little country like Georgia. The NATO alliance isn't necessarily going to want to embrace a country like Georgia if that means it's going to put it at war, essentially, with Russia. NATO would want to avoid that. It would prevent Georgia from being embraced by that military alliance. Also, there are other, obviously, political, games being played, if you will, on the ground by the Russians. The vast majority of people inside South Ossetia have been granted Russian visas, rather Russian passports, which makes them Russian citizens, which means that, Russia can legitimately intervene, it says, to protect its own citizens from attack by Georgians. And so one of the end games that Russia may have is to actually annex this territory of South Ossetia and make it part of Russia, as well as the other breakaway territories inside Georgia, like Abkhazia, which there's a lot of concern inside Georgia could be annexed by Russia.